motion for the Senior Grand Final 2023. This House regrets the shaming or exclusion of prominent figures who are deemed not to meet standards of ideological purity. For example, shaming of Chimamanda Adichie, exclusion of pro-life feminists from Women's March, Megyn Kelly getting death threats from the far right. I'll repeat that again. This House regrets the shaming or exclusion of prominent figures who are deemed not to meet standards of ideological purity. For example, shaming of Chimamanda Adichie, exclusion of pro-life feminists from Women's March, Megyn Kelly getting death threats from the far right. Hopefully an interesting and exciting debate. Congratulations to the team. We hope you have a fantastic debate. I hand over now to the chair of the debate, Kovisha. Good luck to both teams.
Congratulations again to both teams. Just a few reminders that there's a lot of people here and we know things are going to get a bit intense and everyone's going to get a bit excited and agitated. Please just remember to respect the speaker on the floor whilst they are speaking. To the speakers, when you come up to speak, you're welcome to disclose your pronouns if you would like them to be used. Otherwise, you don't have to. It's completely optional. With that in mind, we wish you all the best, and we call upon the first speaker from side composition to begin their case.
Jesus! Am I audible? Usiamasikano, pronouns he, him, and I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Poor women of color in the developing world that don't engage with dominant liberal white feminism don't deserve to be shamed, nor they deserve to be shunned out. Our case is dedicated to showing you something quite simple, that the blatant shaming, the blatant exclusion of those vulnerable, and the creation of them into pariahs by their own communities is something that has been incredibly harmful. In an attempt to show you why that's true, some set up then 2 arguments. The first on the illegitimacy of shaming, the second on how we have better progression, and the third in lexical speech, an argument about how their side has less bias. In an attempt to show you why that's true, some set up. 2 parts here. Firstly, what's our stance? 1, we think shaming and exclusion has gone against the goals of social movements and it's been uniquely problematic and should have not happened. 5 things specifically in which we're talking about. Firstly, what does not meeting standards of ideological purity actually look like? 2 things. 1, it looks like not abiding by the most common and the most mainstream narratives. So it looks like how you oftentimes don't have an acceptance of conservative women into liberal feminist spaces. But secondly, it's generally caused by the fact that you have different factions within social movement, given that an intersectionality exists. Secondly, the individuals we are talking about in this debate are individuals who don't oppose social movements, but simply have different approaches to solving issues. And given the fact that they have a high level of prominence, they have an increased scrutiny placed on them. Thirdly, the counterfactual in which we envision would have been better is a world in which you would have had more nuanced engagement and an increased tolerance of individuals. The reason as to why we think this is true is because when you don't have a shaming out mechanism, when you don't shun people out, we think you're actually forced to have people engage instead of simply conforming to what the mainstream dominant idea is. Fourthly, note that we don't have to support prominent leaders who have been homophobic. We don't have to support prominent leaders that have been uniquely problematic. We think we can still oppose bigots. However, we think the mechanism in which opposing bigotry through exclusion and through shaming them is something that we simply don't support. Fifthly, This debate is about people in these social movements. This is because of two reasons. Firstly, you can only exclude someone from a social movement if you're actually in that social movement. But secondly, the people in social movements are likely the individuals who are going to care about the types of nuances in things like commentary and the types of nuances in things like action. Those are the individuals who we're talking about largely in this debate. Second part of setup. We're willing to trade off potential for something like counterproductivity on our side to happen, given the fact that you have more diverse and ranging ideas. Two reasons we don't care though. One, it's only counterproductive to one part of the movement and to the one that's the majority. We think you cannot determine what the most valuable ideology is, and you cannot determine what the most valuable part of a sector is, so we think it's not legitimate in trying, so we think it being only counterproductive to that one part is something that we're okay with. But secondly, we think there's still productivity that exists in actually engaging with the individuals. Within actually having discourse with the people who matter, who are different, but in your same sect is something that we still value. We're going to show you later why discourse is actually so important. Given that setup, first argument then about the illegitimacy to shame these individuals. There's 4 levels here, but before I prove these, I'll take a POI. Yes, we do. Argument then about the illegitimacy to shame these individuals. 4 levels here. Firstly, we think you are illegitimate in the sense that you harm the principles of movements. Social movements aim to reduce discrimination. However, we think uniquely in the way of the use of shaming, they've been incredibly bad for not only individuals, but for movements in and of themselves. They've been incredibly bad for individuals in 2 ways. One, we think when you are a disadvantaged minority, when you have the only platform and community in a social movement, and your social movement creates barriers for you, that is something that is not okay, and that is something that is illegitimate. But secondly, oftentimes shaming involves a deconstruction of your identity. So because you are a conservative feminist, you are now perceived as no longer being a woman. That is something that is illegitimate. That is something that has been incredibly harmful. The second reason as to why it has been harmful for movements is because you have a principal inconsistency that exists. The way in which this happens is because you advocate for the rights of women, but you simultaneously try to bar them. You advocate for the liberation of individuals, but you simultaneously try to shame them. That is a principally inconsistent line that we think is illegitimate. Second reason as to why you have an illegitimacy created is because ideological purity in and of itself is something that's discriminatory. Think about how the disproportionate harms that exist to people in the developing world. The mainstream ideas of feminism often come from Western nations, but we think developing nations are uniquely different in 2 ways. One, through cultural differences. So we think you're in different circumstances completely, and the way in which you have learned about life and the way in which you engage socially is completely different from the West. But secondly, there is a difference in need of actual application. Think about how mainstream feminists in the West apply for things like lenient feminism and things like trying to garner spaces in corporate. But oftentimes, developing nation feminism looks at solving issues which are very different in their nature. We think then that ideological purity in and of itself is discriminatory to the individuals who are harmed the most. The third level as to why it is illegitimate is because basically, in and of itself, shaming is something that is not okay. At the point at which you endanger someone through death threats, at the point at which you have the exclusion of those types of individuals, at the point at which you try to damage the livelihoods of people who have actually opted into movements, we think that is something that we cannot support. The fifth reason as to why it is illegitimate is because the concept in and of itself is arbitrary, and there's 2 reasons why here. The first is because ideologies can't actually be defined. We think there are too many nuances and complexities in race, and there are too many nuances and complexities in identity, and how individuals actually opt into those things. We think arbitrarily something about purity is something that's completely arbitrary, something that can't be measured. But secondly, we think purity and ideological purity is based and premised in the way in which society actually engages, like socially. We think those are the types of things that are always changing in status quo. We think you cannot measure ideological purity as something that is always changing. Given the fact that it is arbitrary, you cannot actually force individuals to opt out of things like social movements because of it. We think there is an illegitimacy that exists to shame these individuals. Second argument then about how you have the harm to progression of the movements. There's 2 levels of analysis here. The first level of analysis is to say that the nature of engagement you're getting is actually going to be far, far worse on their side. There's 3 reasons here. The first is because the nature of their engagement is likely going to be very divisive. We think when you're only actually engaging with individuals who you want to agree, when you're only engaging with individuals who agree to and conform to the wider mainstream narrative, and you're not actually engaging with individuals who have different views, you're likely then going to have an increased polarization because you're not likely then going to compromise on issues. The second reason as to why the nature of engagement is bad is because you're only engaging with a limited number of people, given the fact that you have a nature of exclusion that's taking place. The third reason as to why their nature of engagement is bad is because you're likely going to increase stereotypes that exist. When you only engage with individuals and like the types of feminists and the most extreme views, you're then likely going to reinforce the pre-existing structures that those individuals are individuals that can't be engaged with. Those individuals can't be moderate. Those individuals can't be palatable. You're likely then going to increase the stereotypes that exist. They're worse for the nature of engagement. The nature of engagement is uniquely bad. The second reason as to why they harm progression is because they have less discourse on their side. Discourse is especially important because no social movement is perfect. No narrative in and of itself is perfect. They harm discourse in the sense that they only have like echo chambers being created, in the sense that you don't actually have different types of engagement with individuals. Discourse is especially important for two reasons. One, discourse is the way in which we shape policies. Policies are created through individuals having conversations and being uniquely tailored to specific circumstances. But secondly, discourse ensures the most vulnerable of individuals are protected. When you have a platform on that feminist group to speak, when you have the platform to actually voice out your issues, you think you're likely then going to get policies specifically tailored to you as the most vulnerable person in the room. Their side harms progression. Why is harming progression something that's uniquely harmful? The first reason is because individuals are in dire circumstances. The instances in which minorities are in are ones that are urgent. The second reason is because on both sides of this debate, we're talking about social movements and societal causes. We show you how we're better for that in the sense that we improve progression. If your vote is with a team that supports the actual progression of people on the ground, then your vote is a plus.
Am I audible? Okay, I'll be starting. Okay, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Debating is something about proving which ideologies are pure and shaming other ideologies for being impure. This is why losing a debate is so painful, but this is also why we get constructive engagement in debates on how to fix world issues. Before I go into my rebuttal, let's look at a major flaw inside Proposition's case. We think this flaw is the fact that they decide to only engage with one type of vulnerable groups, that being minorities. Note that this debate involves shaming prominent figures, and yes, we can have minority representation in prominent figures, but we also have prominent figures look like privileged people who have a lot of power and a lot of capital and money. This looks like Taylor Swift being a prominent figure. We think they need to engage with this on their side. There are a few points of rebuttal then. On their point where they tell us that you only exclude someone from a social movement if you're actually in that social movement, here I'll also respond to that idea of them having ranging and nuanced ideas. We think firstly, while this debate not taken encompasses like social movements, we think it also encompasses common groups in society that share broad values based on those ideologically pure standards. We think people who shame the prominent figures are like the people within those groups, not just people within social movements. This is another example of how their framing is extremely limited within this debate. We think an example of this is encompassing things like religious groups, like areas of largely shared political ideas. But secondly, we think no, they don't have diverse and ranging ideas. We think it's one broad idea shared by a large group of people and another contrasting idea that is shared, not taken, that is like given by a prominent figure. We think that this idea is impure to the value of that broad idea is based on, and that's brought by the prominent figure. That is why these groups want to shame them. On their principal argument then, we think the major flaw, once again, is arguing with the framing of one type of movement. At the point at which they argue about Western feminism, where they base their arguments on Western feminism, they don't, it's something that doesn't encompass the entire world. We think they need to argue for areas with things like broadly shared political beliefs. For example, a widely right-wing area where a prominent figure then brings forward a left-wing idea. We think in that area, that's going to be seen as like an ideologically not taken, an ideologically impure standard. We think then on the points of discourse, Joost is going to deal with this, but we also then show you why we get better discourse, because they can't get discourse on their side when they don't explicitly point out the harms of a prominent figure sharing an ideological impure standard and ideas based on this. What we have shown you here is firstly that they don't get nuance at the point at which they don't point these out, but also their argument doesn't align with engaging in major areas of this debate. What that means, not taken, is their benefits are extremely mitigated, but also the harms that they point out on our side are extremely mitigated. Our stance here is that shaming and excluding, we don't regret shaming and excluding prominent figures who don't meet the standards of ideological purity, because we think it's better for the protection of ideological purity and that not taken, which groups rely on. We're going to prove three things. Firstly, that it's illegitimate to shame these, that it's legitimate rather to shame these figures, and secondly, two things rather, that we better uphold the role of prominent figures. Three arguments. I'll be taking the first two. Firstly, on why it's legitimate to shame and exclude prominent figures. Secondly, why we get better engagement with prominent figures. Joost will take a third argument on discourse. On my first argument then, of why it's legitimate to shame and exclude prominent figures. Some framing for this argument. Firstly, what shaming and exclusion looks like. This looks like being done by groups who share common beliefs, and those beliefs being formed on ideologically pure standards. We think this looks like them staying true to the values of the agenda that these groups are pushing, but this also exists on a spectrum from average society sharing common beliefs and morals to beliefs from higher grounds like religion and things like that. This looks like religious followers shaming a priest who they don't believe is true to the values of their religion. But second, not taken, on the ideological purity, we think these values are seen to be good and morally right, and purity in general just has a good and a moral connotation. Firstly, on this argument then, the fact that we value the ability to have a voice and act on your opinion. We think for A here, when we use this as a mechanism, when we use shaming and exclusion of prominent figures as a mechanism to push something onto society, groups of people are likely to push good things because they're based on ideologically pure standards, but also ideological purity just inherently means that they're good. But B, the idea of freedom and speech and freedom of speech and expression is something that's just deeply enshrined on people within society, and this not taken, and that is the reason why we have debates about large issues and large problems. This is the link and the importance of my intro. We think then, what this means is that this is fulfilled on our side rather when we maintain your ability to shame and exclude prominent figures that directly oppose the groups, the ideas and the beliefs that you believe not taken are ideologically pure. Why this applies to our side is because shaming and exclusion is a direct result of people disagreeing with these values and pushing and acting against these values. That is exactly what freedom of speech is, not taken. Just on a preemptive note, the reason why we still enshrine this, even for prominent figures, and this is why we have principle consistency, is because shaming is not a direct or is not a tangible infringement on your right to freedom of speech and on your right to freedom of expression. It's simply just saying, I don't think that this is ideologically pure, not taken, and this is something that's harmful to our agenda. We think secondly then, we maintain the individual ability to remain safe and protected. We think ideological purity is informed by beliefs that are very close to people's hearts. They have a spiritual connection to these beliefs because this informs every aspect of their lives and their identity. When people feel harmed by prominent figures, they're not upholding their standards. We think we value not taken the ability to fight against that, to shame and exclude these people. The conclusion here, we've already shown you why it's likely that people are going to be pushing good things and this is going to be good for their agenda, but we also think that we don't think it matters where this ideological purity actually is informed by, even if that isn't proved on our side. We think shaming and exclusion and the ability to do so is something extremely valuable. We've shown you here that shaming and exclusion of prominent figures is legitimate and a justified thing for people to do. On the second argument then of why we get comparatively better engagement with prominent figures, we think these look like celebrities, influential figures, and even politicians. These prominent figures, A, A, are very influential, B, they have social power because they're influential, but C, they have a lot of money and they're established within society. We think when people have power, they're able to push their own agendas, especially this is harmful when they're pushing agendas that are ideologically impure. This is words on proposition because they don't have opposition to these harmful ideas when you don't shame and exclude these. We think this is bad engagement with prominent figures because they have too much power and they're able to push these ideologically impure standards, and even if they don't try to, they use their power to the detriment of broader groups. This is true because they come from that position of power. This looks like we think we're better on our side rather because we try to exclude these prominent figures from society. This looks like me having a set work that on Chimamanda Adichie and gaining taking it with a grain of salt because of the fact that we shame her in society.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. I want you to note the rhetoric that the opposition uses. They say that they are for free speech, but at the very same time, the mechanism that they're trying to defend is having to oppose other individuals' free speech by excluding them from society. If it is true that you value free speech at all, you don't think that the mechanism that you would be defending is the very same hill that you'd be willing to die on. Because if it is, then you're going to die a really quick death, and this trophy is likely going to be going to Joost van der Westhuizen. 2 questions that I'm going to be asking in rebuttal. The first is that is it justified to having to exclude people from society because of the fact that they are not ideologically pure? But secondly, is that is it actually effective in having to gain the very same accountability and discourse that they wanted to talk about? Let's firstly look at whether or not it is a justified thing. They tell us that you can act on your opinion because of the fact that you have free speech, and that's something that you should be exercising. 2 responses to this. The first is that they value opinions, yet shun out people for having to contradict those very same ideologies. The reason why it is that we have debates is because of the fact that we recognize that society isn't perfect and that ideologies do not exist in a singular vacuum where we consider one thing to be the overarching rule of society. It is because of the fact that we continuously disagree about what it is that society ought to look like, but continuously disagree about what it is that society should look like in the future. So you having to shun people out because of the fact that they're contradicting your views isn't a proportional response to those individuals' free speech, but furthermore takes away that free speech in the first place, so you aren't defending that principle. The second response that we have here is that the very same free speech that they're doing here excludes people from society, meaning that you're undermining the capacity for that free speech to actually be powerful for other individuals. That's to say that individuals like Chimamanda Adichie continuously feel threatened and continuously feel attacked for having to voice out opinions that they feel as if are important to them and not to the broader rest of society. We think that those very same shunning out are the very same reason why it is that people are less willing to engage in society. And on their side, if it is that people are not willing to engage in society principally, you don't achieve the outcomes that they have about free speech because of the fact that you do not have that free speech in the first place. Let's look at what we told you here and why it is that the lack of responsiveness to those things is something that was important. 3 things that Osiame told you that Danny chose to ignore. The first is that ideological impurity is a completely arbitrary concept for 2 reasons. The first is because of the fact that ideologies on their own are subjective, meaning that you cannot define how it is that ideologies exist in any vacuum or in any instance in society, meaning that they can't tell us that we're justified in having to shun people out because they themselves don't know what the correct ideology is. But the second thing is that it's dependent on a changing society. That's to say that ideologies are likely to change all the time, so you can't be shutting people out for something that is going to be temporary. temporary. We don't think then it's a proportional response because of the fact that you aren't actually treating people in a fair manner. The second thing that we told you here is that it's inconsistent. That's to say that it's incredibly bad because of the fact that you're neglecting the people who are in need of your support as a member of a social movement, but furthermore as a member of the broader society. But the third thing that we told you is that anything that threatens the safety of individuals is illegitimate. That's to say that the manner in which majority of this shunning out has existed is through death threats. We don't think that that's a legitimate form of having to shun people out because of the fact that you continuously impose on their rights and their ability to be individuals within society. Comparatively, why is it that we are better? The first is because of the fact that the right to safety makes it possible for any ideology to exist within society in the first place. So when it is that you have that safety, you're most likely going to have ideologies thriving, and that's when you can actually validate the free speech of individuals. But the second thing is that to say that you do not allow for people to impose cultures upon you once it is that you respect the dignity of those individuals. On their side, you continuously impose cultures because of the fact that you continuously tell individuals what the correct ideology is instead of having to engage in the ideologies that they value and they see as important. Principally, they cannot stand within this debate. Let's look then at the practical arguments that they give us. They give us two things. The first is that we can also engage with prominent figures that are bad. Cool. Why is this something that doesn't actually benefit your case? Two reasons. The first is that once you extract these people from society, you have less engagement with these people in its entirety, meaning that the argumentation of accountability is less likely going to be feasible because of the fact that you aren't engaging with these people in the first place. But secondly, they utilize that rhetoric to shun people out for continuously having to directly attack them and all of those things. That's to say that the reason why it is that Donald Trump is continuously a great populist leader amongst the right is because of the fact that he's able to utilize the rhetoric that liberals aren't understanding of what it is that conservatives' views are, and they can gatekeep whatever it is that they feel as if was important to them. Meaning that it's far worse for individuals on their side because of the fact that you don't have that engagement with them, but furthermore, with that you allow for these individuals to become far worse because of the fact that you aren't engaging with them in the long run. Comparatively, in their best case, they fail to actually hold these people to account, but furthermore, they fail to actually ensure that the engagement that they have with these individuals is likely going to be genuine, but furthermore, something that is likely going to produce the actual change that they wanted. This just proves to you why it is that the mechanism that the opposition is trying to prove is principally incorrect, but furthermore, just takes down the societal structures that we've actually tried so hard to build. Before I move into my argumentation of why it is that we have less buy-in into social movements, sure.
Why is it beneficial to you when people engage blindly with impure ideologies and are unaware of how prominent figures are?
That assumes that people don't engage with actual genuine conversations as to what it is that society ought to look like. We continuously have debates about why it is that certain things are important. That's why we're having this final right now. But furthermore, we continuously engage with why it is that society needs to have these kinds of engagements in the first place. That's why you have political discussions. That's why you have discussions amongst boardrooms and amongst your friends in the first place. Why is it that they need to less buy-in on their side? The first is because of the fact that you create apathy towards these social movements for two reasons. The first is because of the fact that you engage with individuals in their most extreme cases. That's to say that you go into conversations with the concept that limits the genuine engagement with those people. That's to say that this person is a conservative, therefore they need to be excluded from society. But the second reason why it is that you create apathy is because of the fact that you centralize only one form of power within social movements. That's to say that African feminism has always been shunned out by the overseeding concept of white feminism, and that has led for black women not to feel like being a part of the feminist movement in its entirety. The impact of this goes twofold. The first is that they decrease the ability for people to actually care about the movement once it is that you've been excluded from the movement in the first place. The second reason why it is that it's impactful because of the fact that you have narratives around that social movement becoming far worse because of the fact that you are unable to engage with these individuals in a genuine manner and in a manner that is actually likely going to get the best views of each side in either case. The second reason why it is they get less buy-in is because of the fact that they represent less people. This is for two reasons. The first is because of the fact that you cut off a large number of people who have been affiliated to whatever prominent figure that you have. This is where echo chambers exist because of the fact that once you cut off those individuals, they're most likely going to go into the most radical views that they have within society in order to ensure that they could protect their best interests. But secondly, it's because of the fact that you do not make attempts at actually considering the various intersections of society. That's to say that you look at society upon one lens and don't actually focus on how it is that society can progress. Opposition can't take your vote because of the fact that society is continuously stagnant under their world proposition wins.
Our stance on opposition was incredibly clear. We support shaming prominent figures because of two main reasons. One, because it is a strategy to protect yourself and your beliefs. Two, because we can't face, as a movement, as a very vulnerable movement, somebody trying to attack those beliefs. That is something that the prop bench refuses to engage with. But before that, I want to deal with two questions in the speech. Firstly, is it principally legitimate to exclude prominent figures from the movement and the beliefs? And secondly, do we change the engagement of people with prominent figures? But before that, let's deal with the central way-up that exists in the round before I even do this. What is the way-up? This is whether we want very pure ideology or whether we want your right to have your freedom of speech heard within that movement. One, quite literally, we don't care about what the side proposition bench says about wanting prominent figures' voices to be heard within social movements. This is because the way they frame the debate in Proposition 1 is that this hatred exists for these ideologies on either side of the House. So this is to say, if that influence and that hatred already exists, the only difference is on their side, they nullify it and they make it silent hatred. That is something that we cannot stand for. But before that, let's deal with three strategic flaws of the bench. The first is proposition only engages with one kind of actor, oppressed actors in this debate. We think it is far worse, one, because we tell you that when there is a black woman who is literally getting death threats from right-wing organizations, the hatred that you get is silent. We think that when you actually shame her, society is aware and society can form a basis around this is wrong or this is right. They can choose a side. We think on their side, when you try and diversify the movement like they claim, you try and bring her in and still have that hatred. The only difference is that it is silent and her voice will not be heard. No. Secondly, let's talk about their counterfactual because it is wrong. They say that they're going to be diversifying views on their side of the House. We think this was the wrong counterfactual because they like to claim that people and prominent figures have very vastly different values from the ones within that movement. So if that is the case, we don't think that the prominent figure is going to nullify or dilute their view in order to fit in with a movement. They didn't show us that either. Finally, let's talk about ideologies being temporary, because that seems to be their main line of response to why it is principally illegitimate to shame people. No, we think it is great that they recognize that ideologies are temporary, but it doesn't dilute our principle that it is not that it is legitimate to exclude prominent figures from the movement and beliefs. If we can prove to you that it is a form of protection, we win this. Firstly, let's talk about, is it principally legitimate to exclude prominent figures from the movement and belief? Danny gave you 4 things under here, no, all of which go unresponded to. 1, this is how groups of people establish their identity, through their shared beliefs. Secondly, we spoke to you about the freedom of speech and why that was necessarily something that we value, specifically for groups who are going to be nullified by the voices of prominent figures. Thirdly, we told you even if it fails, the attempt and the tactic to try and forward your goals, to try and make people hear your voice is something that we value. Finally, we told you that social movements and groups of people do not operate in monoliths. That is to say that we understand that the feminist movement has 2 different groups of people, pro-choice and pro-life, that the types of discussions that they need to be having, sit down, is that need to be having discussions about how to best forward the goals of the feminist movement, not necessarily trying to argue over those differences. I'm going to show you why we get that in our argument on discourse. I'll flag you when I'm open to take a POI. What do they tell you? 1, that they oppose bigots on their side of the House and they never had to support it. 1, we don't think it was very contentious, but they never actually tell us what a bigot actually is. So on their side of the House, it could look very ambiguous and it could look like Taylor Swift. But secondly, we think it was very harmful to their case because they basically tried to frame every social prominent figure that exists and chose to only support very one minute part of the spectrum. Secondly, they told us that they diversify views on their side of the house. One, this implies that a prominent figure is going to relay their message correctly when they're suddenly taken into the movement and they're suddenly included. We think strategically that is just wrong, and it meant that their counterfactual was never going to have to work. So they need to do the groundwork in their second in order to fix that no. Finally, we think it is very important that they never showed us this, because we told you that if you care so deeply about your pro-choice movement, because it is directly tied up to your identity, directly tied up to your ethnicity, directly tied up to your choices that you make, then it is very unlikely that you're going to let somebody into your movement, let somebody into your beliefs. But finally, the only thing that they told us and here is that you strip people of their identity. One, no you don't. We already explained to you the different types of things that make people make choices that form their identity, so you don't strip people of that. But secondly, we think it is far worse on their side of the house when you have a prominent figure trying to fit themselves into that picture. We think they're wrong. So on the way up, no, we win for a couple of reasons. One, because we understand that protection as a group, specifically when we have prominent figures that are probably going to still be prominent on either side of the house, we would say that we give that that protection to groups that are vulnerable. That is something that we support. Secondly, let's talk about, do we support the change and engagement of people with prominent figures? One, we told you that figures are very powerful and have very little opposition because they are viewed as perfect and they're viewed as serving the goals of a movement. But secondly, we said that means they have the ability and the capacity to push forward harmful ideas towards minorities. Finally, we think this is the most important part of this clash, that if we are able to view and shame and exclude prominent figures, you cast a shadow of moral doubt. That means that we can view Chimamanda Adichie as a prominent figure, as a feminist author, but also a feminist author that does not believe that transgender people should be in the feminist movement. That is a very important concept of moral doubt that gives you a little bit of awareness when you're reading books. So we think this weighs up to their case because one, we understand that if people want to fit into the movement so badly, then they don't really have an incentive to change. But secondly, we understand that casting a shadow of moral doubt is something we value. But before that, after that, let's talk about discourse. We think what we need to prove to you is that their counterfactual no subtly just accepts and tries to incorporate prominent figures into your movement, just makes people engage in subtle hate. How did this play out? In two ways. One, it looks like movements trying to profit off the fame of prominent figures, so they try and amplify that part of their social movement. But secondly, it looks like trying to assimilate prominent figures into your goals. Finally, we think it looks like either just silently hating them being a part of your movement on their side of the house. We think this is important because in order to create meaningful change in discussion, you do not need to be focused on trying to eliminate that hate and eliminate those differences. You're trying to focus on the differences between your ideologies and therefore trying to promote those forwards. We think one, we get that through shaming because you engage head and straight on with which idea is the most ideologically pure and which idea pushes for the goals of your social movement. But secondly, we think that fundamentally clashing ideologies is something that already exists in society. So when we see people on TV having debates, it's quite literally the principle of debating. Panel, at the end of the day, we don't think that social movements exist in isolation and they do not exist within monoliths. Therefore, you should side with up. Thank you.
Competition is nice in things like debating, in inconsequential recreational activities. Competition is not nice when you peg the factions of feminism against each other to compete for which one has ideological supremacy. We think that the fundamental flaw on side opposition is they don't actually tell us why we need to remove individuals from a movement. We can get accountability on our side. We tell you that in our stance. We can oppose the ideological impurity of an individual. We can oppose the bigoted nature of that individual. But that does not necessitate us to remove them from their identity, to remove them from our movement. The fact that they haven't proven this from O2 immediately shows us they're losing. But what is the strategic flaw they're going to lose this debate on? They don't engage with the true nature of social movements. We don't think it looks like one core idea, one mainstream idea that we ought to be abiding by. What do we mean by this? We don't think that there is actually a core idea, because how would we be able to determine this? 4 reasons why we don't think a core idea is something we can legitimately support. Firstly, because of intersectionality. We think people's ideas are informed by their different sectors of identity. We don't think there's one core idea of feminism. Think about the debates between choice feminism and other forms of feminism. You're literally a debater. We thought you'd know that. Secondly, because we think that there are cultural ideas that inform the way you believe in ideas. We tell you in our first principle, the developing nations are disproportionately harmed because their cultural identities aren't actually taken into account. Their own mechanisms for feminism and mechanisms for other movements aren't taken into account. Thirdly, because we think movements are consistently changing. Think about the fact that way back when they thought that certain things for feminism were okay, they aren't okay in status quo. This is important because it shows you that there isn't one overarching idea that we can buy into. But 4th level, I'm going to extend what we've said. Here's a new level. We think that is largely based on a Western consensus. The West telling you, this is what mainstream ideas should look like, this is what we ought to buy into. In their best case, they only perpetuate Western ideas, they don't account for anyone else. This is incredibly important analysis, because what it shows you is you can't actually talk about these movements as monoliths, and in some way, some minority group within that minority is harmed. They needed to engage with that. But cool, what am I going to do in this speech? Firstly, I'm going to interact with Juhi's matter. It was a bit strange. Secondly, their principle clash. Thirdly, practical clash. Firstly, on what Juhi tells us. She tells us that you can focus on different ideologies and you get this with shaming. Panel, this is untrue. Because if you are shaming an individual, you're dismissing them. You're not engaging with their ideology. You're saying that they're wrong because you don't think that they engage with you truly. How am I going to be able to talk to you if I don't invite you to the conversation in the first place? But furthermore, any engagement you're having with them is likely to be incredibly ineffective because I'm already with the assumption that I am correct, that mainstream ideas are the best ideas, so I'm not actually willing to compromise and be able to engage with you. Compromising is better achieved on our side. So they aren't better for discourse. Cool. Next, let's look at the principal clash. They tell us that they value the ability for individuals to voice their opinions and to act on those opinions. First response, we think that nothing exists in absolutes. Freedom of speech is valuable, but hate speech literally isn't valuable. At the point at which you are infringing on other people's rights and that you're sending them death threats, we don't think your freedom of speech is actually something we care about. Secondly, we told you it was worse on your side, because even if we did value freedom of speech, it is far worse when we tell individuals that once they voice their opinions, they ought to be shunned, shamed, and taken out of that movement from the get-go. But thirdly, we can still have things like free speech. We can still be anti the bad thing that priest did. We can still tell you that what they did wasn't good, but we don't need to tell you that they had no claim to their own religion. Why? Because they never engage with the fact that ideologies can never be pure. There is no such thing as a pure ideology or a pure individual that fully follows that ideology. People exist as people. You have to engage with that. Cool. Next, they tell us that they've been harmed by a lack of purity. Thus, when they see individuals doing bad things, their action is legitimate. Firstly, how are you harmed, panel? If somebody is doing something really strange in their own free time, how is you as an individual harmed? You can still buy into your own version of what ideological purity looks like on your side. We don't think they've proven a harm. Secondly, they still don't prove their burden. Why is me being harmed legitimate in me removing you from a movement? They don't actually make the links for us, panel. We don't think we can fill in their gaps. But thirdly, we think even if this was the case, even if religious leaders weren't being pure, we don't think that's legitimate to shun them out. Because the impact isn't just on those leaders. It is for every individual that buys into what those leaders are saying. They harm the greater scale of that minority group or of that religious group. That is invaluable. Last thing, they tell us that we supposedly didn't interact with, that groups create beliefs under a shared identity. The reason we didn't interact with this is because, yes, they form ideas and beliefs under a shared identity, but that shared identity isn't a monolith, panel. There are many different groups within it. We don't think that was valuable. Well, then do we tell you on principle, and why are we comparatively better? We tell you that you harm the aims of the movement. If the aims of the movement is for equality and to be anti-discrimination, at the point at which I discriminate against my own kind, I'm not good for the movement. Secondly, we tell you that ideological purity as a concept is discriminatory. We tell you about developing nations. Thirdly, we tell you the concept is arbitrary. It changes all the time. Why would we prioritize it? But fourth, we tell you that it shouldn't threaten your place in society. We have no right to send you death threats. On the way up, if it is between protection versus unity, we think we ought to value unifying the movement at all costs, because protection can only occur at the point at which you unify, at the point at which you gather the movement to be able to band together to protect each other. That is the point at which you opt into our principle more. Cool. What do they tell us on practical? They tell us that there is no opposition on our side, and thus we need to exclude individuals for accountability. Firstly, I've already told you why we get accountability. They don't listen to Osiyame's framing. Secondly, we tell you that figures aren't seen as perfect. By virtue of us having this debate, we can recognize that these prominent figures can be problematic. But even if we were opting into that, listen to their characterization. How could I be offended if I thought you were perfect in the first place? It doesn't make sense. Their case is self-defeating. Secondly, we tell you how there is worse accountability on your side. We tell you how you are likely to shun out individuals. What happens when people get shunned out? They become more populist because they want to become extreme, they want to compete. It's now a competition of ideologies. You're inclined to become more extreme. But furthermore, we think that it's actually not just ideological impurity, it's far worse. But thirdly, we tell you how isolation is actually really important to consider. They tell us that we can't just talk about minorities, but excluding minorities from the chat's just far worse. Minorities are incredibly important to even talk about, even if they're not the greatest extent of the actors we're talking about, because excluding them sets the historical precedence that those minorities shouldn't be included in conversations. If you've been historically excluded from conversations, you should be included right now. But furthermore, even if there was no opposition, we're still fine, because accountability is only important at the point at which we're able to prioritize their goals. We prioritize better on our side. Lastly, they tell us, Juhi tells us, that you can still have Chimamanda Adichie being seen as a feminist author. Panel, that is literally a contradiction, because you wouldn't be seen as a feminist author. You would be seen as just an external individual that no longer has a claim to feminism because of your other beliefs. You cannot claim her as a feminist author. You cannot claim any of that. She is no longer a part of the movement. We tell you how you harm progression because of the nature of engagement, the divisiveness, the polarization. We tell you how it limits buy-in. You have more opposition, more apathy. We think that that is not valuable. We think we ought to care about individuals because of the sharing of identity. That is why, even though opposition is going to take the L today, they're still Gauteng. We still love them, but you're siding with proposition.
The logic on the side of the proposition today is absurd. Listen to them. They say that movements are not a monolith, but then their solution is to make them a monolith. It is to shut out the unique voices of people, their unique challenges on their unique issues, but rather to say, oh, we all like feminism. Let's not talk about pro-life versus pro-choice. Let's just make us a monolith. Let's just make us arbitrary. Let's just shut down the goals of getting the actual change that we want. When their problem is not representing enough people, and then they take away those very same people's voices, we think strategically they lost this debate from P1. In my speech, 3 clashes. 1, is it legitimate to shame and exclude people? Number 2, where do we get better engagement and discourse? And number 3, where do we best reduce the harm of these individuals? Let's talk about this first clash. Is it legitimate to shame and exclude people? They give you 4 reasons why it's not in their P1. Number 1, they say you deconstruct people's identities, and that's something that is bad. 1, this just isn't true. Telling someone that I don't want to engage with your belief, I want to exclude you from my own personal sphere because I think it is untrue, is not the same as saying you do not have the right to exist and you do not have the right to your identity. The links don't exist. But secondly, we think deconstructing an identity is reliant on how people experience that, how they experience your challenge on their identity. Why people don't experience this as deconstructing their identity is because under their own characterization, they're not going to take it personally, they're not going to listen to you, they're probably going to back away. I think based on their own characterization, this criteria falls. But secondly, they say that this is illegitimate because it comes from Western nations. And this is their whole chat about the movement fighting against each other and these kinds of things. I think it is quite strange that they assume that movements have to all exist across the whole world, all agreeing on these same things in order to work. Because it is fine that we have Western feminism in America and we have African feminism within Africa, and just because one exists does not mean that the other is illegitimate. So we think it is fine that within spheres, people are able to call out and exclude people that they disagree with within their spheres. This looks like Western feminism calling out people within Western feminism they don't agree with, but it doesn't mean that that has to extend to African feminism, that kind of thing. I think this takes out their second criteria. Thirdly, and maybe more importantly, they tell you that it's unfair to exclude people based on something that is arbitrary. This is crazy. I think it is not true that ideologies are arbitrary. Why? Number one, maybe in general across the world ideologies are arbitrary, but in specific communities where movements and values actually exist, where people live their same lives together, that's when they do share common beliefs. So in this room, we all value debating. Maybe people in another country don't, but we all share the same beliefs. That is something that is not arbitrary, and these are the kinds of spaces where movements exist. But secondly, I think even if they want to say that values are arbitrary, sit down, Nseko. I think we're able to say that we do still share some values. Feminism does still value feminism. I don't think, or fighting for women, I don't think it is true that these things are arbitrary. But secondly, even if it was arbitrary, this principle is flawed because we don't just not take stances on something just because they're arbitrary. That's crazy. Just because we, women may disagree on being pro-life or pro-choice doesn't mean we don't talk about abortion. That doesn't mean we don't actively call out people we don't like. And by the way, their soft conversations are not a valid response to this. I'll deal with this in the second clash. But we think just not engaging and calling out issues we don't like just because they may be muddy, they may be difficult, is not a valid thing. We think this level of their argument is out. Sit down. But finally then, they tell you that it is illegitimate to challenge people's safety. This is just wrong for two reasons. Number one, we don't have to defend actual harm on our side. We don't think we have to defend calling out, we don't think we have to defend death threats at the point at which they cause violent harm. That is something that falls under the scope of the law. That isn't something that falls under the scope of social movements. But secondly, if they want to say that they have such crazy people on their side that would send minorities, not even prominent figures that they were supposed to engage with, death threats, I think that exists on both sides. If you have people with massive hate, and people who are willing to take that to extremes, that is something that exists on both sides. So this means that the last level of their principle, the only one that they were going to rely on, has also fallen. Ultimately, we think the four criteria that they present to you as to why something is legitimate, or as to why this is illegitimate, doesn't work. But what did we tell you? Way more importantly, we told you, number one, that people ought to have a voice and they ought to be able to use that at the point at which they disagree with someone. Their response here is that somehow we're inconsistent because now we take away the voices of other people over other of these prominent figures. This just isn't true because we think the difference is on our side, people literally don't speak up, whereas the difference on their side is that people speak up, but they just don't feel as heard, right? We're not silencing people on their side. We think that is the difference. And freedom of speech is literally the ability, sit down, freedom of speech is literally the ability to voice yourself, to voice your opinions. That is not something we take away on their side. Maybe we take away your ability to be heard, but that's not the same thing. They didn't actually understand what they were saying here. But secondly, we told you that when people's identities feel challenged by the active means of prominent figures that push for pro-life movements, when people's identities and their beliefs feel challenged, then that is when it is justified for them to fight against those prominent figures, to call them out, to exclude them, those kinds of things. Their response here comes in P2, and they say that it's not a proportional response. But at the point at which a prominent figure, and they are prominent figures that have massive influence, is advocating against you if you want to talk about social movements and people having loud voices, and then you feel challenged as a minority who doesn't have that same power, that is a proportional response. We think the damages are the same. At the end of this clash, no. What then is the way up? Maybe on our side, we are harming the voices and the identities of prominent individuals in our worst case, but what we do is give far more of a voice and the ability to voice that to minorities on our side. Why do you weigh this more? Number one, we think we're able to provide more rights, sit down, to a group of people on their side. Maybe we harm one people. Two, on our side, we cater for the minorities, the victims of these movements, not the privileged individuals who already have the capital to fight for themselves. But number three, on our side, we have a far greater impact. People feel heard when they have nothing else and they only have that movement. On their side, maybe like a prominent celebrity gets like a little nick in their budget, those kinds of things. Ultimately, we think we're able to show you how it's far more legitimate at the point at which you call out these celebrities, you shame them. But secondly, let's talk about engagement and discourse. What do they tell you? Number one, that you get polarization. Two responses. It is true, firstly, that people's opinions on like both sides are probably the same. They hold these same beliefs. The difference here is not that like people's beliefs become more polarized, but rather, or do those beliefs, are those beliefs voiced like loudly, or rather are they like silent hate? I think loud is the comparative because people still hate on both sides. Why it's better on our side? Number one, we think people are aware of the differences. Number two, there is an urgency to try to fix them as opposed to ignoring them. But number three, because people are emotionally engaged, we think they're more willing to deal with them as opposed to it being easier to push them under the carpet on their side. Secondly, they tell you that we have echo chambers on our side. I think this just simply isn't true on the basis that the prominent figures wouldn't have engaged with you in the first place, given that these are like celebrities. They're not your average like person who can come to your like social movement meetings. But secondly, that they have actively different beliefs than you, and maybe they were like, and I don't think they would actually like come to listen to you and come to join your movement. This argument relied on a lot of assumptions, and the links just weren't there. So ultimately, we think we're also able to show you, under this clash, that you have far less engagement and discourse. But finally, let's talk about where we actually reduce the harm of these prominent individuals. We told you that this debate was not about changing their mind because they're powerful. They actively like fight against you, so they're not going to engage with you. But finally, that you give them no reason to engage when you only have soft comparisons. They told you that people buy out. We don't think that's true because they weren't going to listen to you in the first place. For all of these reasons, vote opposition.
Just like the proposition case claims about an example of debating on extremes, I think that's exactly what they did. They debated on the worst extreme that they possibly could. The debate was never about different factions of feminism going to war against each other, and it was actually about different beliefs, deep inherent beliefs to you, trying to protect themselves against prominent figures. They never actually engaged with that context, and they refused to believe it at all. I want to deal with a couple of strategic flaws before showing you why in our absolute worst case we still take the debate. Firstly, let's just talk about the way we exclude and shame people within social movements. One, we think it looks like saying you're wrong because you don't meet up with our standards of what we believe and what we do. But secondly, we think this is very important because as it presently stands, Chimamanda Adichie is considered as a feminist author. The only difference on our side is that she is excluded and she is shamed because she doesn't believe that transgender people should be part of the feminist movement. This was a very important piece of characterization because it showed you what moral doubt actually does. It shows you that you can read literature with a pinch of salt. You can read it with the ability that not everybody you're going to be looking at, not every single prominent figure believes in one belief, believes in one believes in one mindset, because people are different, like beliefs exist in intersections. But secondly, we think they missed the core of the debate essentially, because the core of the debate was about where do we protect people's beliefs. They tell you that they protect them by diversifying like lots of beliefs. We already told you that if it is that people don't agree with the prominent figures already like very dominant and prominent belief, then it isn't very likely that they're going to accept you into their belief with open arms. They refuse to engage with this context as well. So what is their absolute best case in this debate? One, we say that people get prominent individuals get very positive engagement with the public, and secondly, that you definitely know like the influence that you have, prominent people fit into the movement. In our absolute worst case, we isolate individuals and alienate people from the movement. Why do we win in our absolute worst case? One, because we understand that if you do not agree with a certain value, with a certain ideal, then you are allowed as somebody who is part of a belief to protect yourself and shut people out. But secondly, Secondly, we spoke to you about the prominence of prominent individuals and why that was something we value, because if their belief is so dominantly heard in society, we need that shame and we need that exclusion to counteract that already existing glorification of those prominent idols. Finally, we told you that the only response about intersectionality still exists on our side of the house. Why? Because we understand that beliefs exist very differently. So that is to say that if you are still pro-choice and you still have a different idea of feminism, it doesn't automatically mean you are excluded from the movement unless you attack it directly, like what prominent figures are doing. They refuse to engage with that as well. So a couple of things that they didn't choose to respond to in this debate. One, we told you that people's interests are divided, but they are divided into beliefs. And when prominent figures attack those, it is legitimate to shame them. No response. Secondly, we told you that only shaming and excluding prominent figures from a particular belief counteracts and is very proportional mechanism to the amount of influence they have in projecting their beliefs into society. No response. Finally, we told you protection is something we value because we understand that when you are a prominent figure, you can get away with being very ambiguous, pretending that you are part of a movement, pretending you are part of a particular belief. We don't support that either. No response. And finally, we told you that we get more discourse on our side of the house when we have two ideas directly clashing against each other. That's literally how the theory of debating works. No response. Panel, please do not buy in to the ideologically impure case of proposition. Thank you.
Cool. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The performance of opposition is much like the motion that we're debating today, trying to gaslight us and having to exclude us from any kind of conversation by having to not engage in POIs, but furthermore not having to rebut majority of the argumentation that we give you. Not only do they misrepresent the case that we've given to you, but furthermore assume a lot about their own case without having to prove the mechanistic analysis behind those things. 3 strategic flaws that make the opposition case fall. The first is that they assume that they can have meaningful conversations with people while also advocating for shunning people out in order to protect your own identity. Why is this something that's bad for their case? The first is that if people are so self-interested, people will not have the willingness to engage with one another because of the fact that they'll always focus on their identity first as opposed to having that conversation in the first place. But secondly, is that even if they do have that conversation isn't likely going to be as meaningful as they wanted it to be. 2 reasons why. The first is because of the fact that you always go into the concept of that conversation with you being the right individual and the other person not being correct in most instances. But secondly, is because of the fact that that very same conversation is incredibly divisive because of the fact that we can't agree on certain things, but furthermore, we exclude whatever opinion that we have with one another because of the fact that you want to maintain whatever identity that you have on your own. The second strategic flaw is that there's a huge line shift between the P1 and the P3. That's to say that they said that they want to have conversations, but at the same time, the P1 emphasized why it is that you have to gatekeep conversations in order to keep your identity pure. Pick a stance, both of them are mutually exclusive. Quite literally, you couldn't do so. This goes to prop. The third thing that makes them fall is that they assume that the actors that we're talking about are in direct opposition of the ideologies that we're talking about here. We think that the reason why it is that this is wrong is because of the fact that we continuously have disagreements about what exactly we need to be doing, but not disagreements about the outcome that we're supposed to be achieving in the first place. What this means then is that we are not in direct contradiction of those identities. The manner in which we engage those identities is what becomes contentious. To that extent, then, the very same principal argument that they were trying to propose for isn't really as impactful. First clash then, on the principle. Here, the main theme is on free speech. What did we tell you? Three things. The first is that ideological purity is an arbitrary concept for 3 reasons. The first is that it's subjective. The second is that it's dependent on a changing societal narrative. But thirdly is that it's premised upon things that people have very little control over. The reason why it is that this is very important is because of the fact that since it is arbitrary, you cannot justify any form of exclusion, but furthermore, any shunning out of these individuals in the first place. Because of the fact that the reason reason why it is that you're doing this to them isn't as tangible as it should have been. The second thing that we told you is that the fact that you're threatening people's lives, and that's something that should always be considered as illegitimate. Having to send death threats to a person merely because of the fact that you don't agree with their ideology is an illegitimate form of having to protect your identity, even if it is that you consider it valuable. The third reason why it is that they're illegitimate is because of the fact that they're attacking the very same identity that they set out to protect. That's to say that the trade-off that they had to make is having to make sure that one identity is always likely to supersede the other. That very same concept contradicts why it is that the principle is most likely going to be effective, because of the fact that you always have to make the trade-off of which identity ought be the most valuable. We think that that very same trade-off isn't one that coincides with their principle. Principally, you can't side with an inconsistent team like opposition. Then let's look at the idea of practicality. They tell us about silence. First things first, if it is that you actually care about these issues, we have no reason to remain silent in the first place. But secondly, that if it is that these very same individuals need to speak out, they can speak out without having to be problematic. And that's the idea that we gave you on the proposition that went largely unresponded to. This final went to proposition quite clearly because of the fact that we can give you tangible outcomes, but furthermore show you why it is that we're principally justified.